She was promised to the Duke of Claymore, a contract signed over her cradle when she was just 3 days old. 23 years of preparation, of learning to be the perfect duchess, all leading to this one moment. But when Marguerite Wentworth finally stood at the altar in her cream silk gown, the Duke looked past her and chose someone else. Her younger sister. In front of all of England's finest families, he shattered her future with 5 devastating words. Could Marguerite survive the scandal? Could she walk out of that chapel with her dignity intact? What happened next changed everything. Hello my lovely listeners, if you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you can, kindly tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It always brings a smile to my face knowing where in the world my stories get to. Let's continue with our story. Marguerite Wentworth stood perfectly still before the looking-glass in her bedchamber at Wentworth Hall. The morning of May 3, 1848, had arrived with pale spring sunlight streaming through the leaded windows, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. This was the day she had been raised for, trained for, prepared for since she was an infant. Her wedding day. The cream silk gown wrapped around her like a second skin, the French lace at the collar and sleeves catching the light with every breath she took. 8 months of fittings, 8 months of seamstresses fussing over every stitch, every detail, all to create the perfect image of a future duchess. The dress was beautiful, she could admit that much. It was everything a bride should wear when marrying into one of England's most powerful families. Tess, her lady's maid, circled her one final time, adjusting a fold of silk here, smoothing a wrinkle there. The older woman's eyes were misty as she stepped back to admire her work. "You look like an angel descended from heaven itself, Miss Marguerite," Tess whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "His Grace will be struck speechless when he sees you." Marguerite tried to smile, but her face felt stiff, as though she were wearing a mask. Her hands gripped the bouquet of white roses too tightly, the stems pressing into her palms through her delicate gloves. There was a tightness in her chest that had been there since she'd woken before dawn, a pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. "Thank you, Tess," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "You have worked wonders." It was not fear exactly, this feeling that gripped her. It was something else, something she could not quite name. Anticipation, perhaps. Or the weight of knowing that in a few short hours, her entire life would change. She would no longer be Marguerite Wentworth, daughter of Lord Frederick Wentworth. She would be the Duchess of Claymore, wife to Julian Harrington, one of the most eligible men in all of England. The marriage contract had been signed over her cradle when she was only 3 days old. Julian had been 7 at the time, a young boy who probably had no idea what was being decided for him. Their families had joined their futures together with ink and parchment, sealing a bond that would benefit both houses. The Wentworths would gain the prestige of a ducal connection, and the Harringtons would gain a substantial dowry and political alliances. Marguerite had grown up knowing she would be Julian's wife. There had never been any question about it, never any room for doubt or alternative paths. Every lesson she'd learned, every skill she'd mastered, had been in service to this single purpose. She spoke French and Italian fluently. She played the pianoforte with skill. She knew how to manage a household staff, how to plan elaborate dinners, how to move through society with grace and dignity. She could discuss politics without being too opinionated, laugh at jokes without being too loud, and charm guests without being too familiar. She was, in every way, the perfect future duchess. And Julian was, in every way, the perfect future husband. At least, that's what she'd been told. That's what she'd convinced herself to believe during their carefully chaperoned visits over the years. He was handsome, certainly. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and sharp features that reminded her of the portraits of his ancestors hanging in Claymore House. He was educated, well-spoken, and moved through society with the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. But did she love him? That was a question Marguerite had learned not to ask herself. Love was a luxury for people who had choices. She had duty, responsibility, and a lifelong contract that bound her to Julian as surely as iron chains. She had told herself that respect would be enough, that affection would grow with time, that the warmth she felt when thinking of her future title and position was close enough to happiness. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Tess hurried to answer it, and Lord Frederick Wentworth stepped into the room. Marguerite's father was a tall man with greying hair and a stern expression that rarely softened, even for his daughters. He wore his finest coat today, the buttons polished to a shine, and he carried himself with the rigid posture of a military officer, though he'd never served. His eyes swept over Marguerite, taking in every detail of her appearance. For a moment, something that might have been pride flickered across his face, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "It is time," he said simply, his voice gruff. "The carriages are ready. The guests are already arriving at the chapel." Marguerite nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She set down the bouquet long enough to pick up her veil, the delicate tulle cascading down her back like a waterfall of mist. Tess helped her arrange it over her carefully styled auburn curls, pinning it in place with pearl-tipped pins that had belonged to her grandmother. "You understand the importance of today," her father continued, watching as Tess made the final adjustments. "The honor you bring to our family name. The duty you fulfill." "Yes, father," Marguerite replied, the words automatic. She had heard variations of this speech countless times over the years. "The Duke of Claymore is a powerful man. This alliance secures our position in society for generations to come. You must not disappoint us, Marguerite. You must not disappoint him." "I understand, father." He nodded curtly, apparently satisfied. "Then let us proceed. Your future awaits." Marguerite picked up her bouquet once more, the white roses trembling slightly in her grip. She took one last look at herself in the looking-glass, memorizing the face that stared back at her. This would be the last time she saw herself as simply Marguerite Wentworth. The next time she looked in a mirror, she would be a different woman entirely. A duchess. A wife. The journey down the grand staircase of Wentworth Hall felt like walking through a dream. Servants lined the hallway, bowing and curtsying as she passed, their faces bright with excitement. Cook was crying into her apron. The butler stood at attention by the front door, his usually stern face softened with what might have been affection. The carriage ride to the chapel passed in a blur of countryside and spring flowers. Her father sat across from her, silent and watchful. Marguerite kept her eyes on the window, watching the familiar landscape roll past. These were the lands she had grown up on, the hills and streams she had explored as a child. Soon, they would belong to her past, and her future would be in Claymore, on Julian's vast estate in the north. When the chapel finally came into view, Marguerite's heart began to pound in earnest. It was a beautiful old building, its stone walls covered in climbing roses, its tall windows gleaming in the morning sun. But it was the number of carriages crowded around the entrance that made her breath catch. Dozens of them, belonging to the finest families in England. Peers of the realm, military heroes, wealthy merchants eager to rub shoulders with nobility. They had all come to witness this union, to see Marguerite Wentworth become the Duchess of Claymore. The carriage rolled to a stop, and a footman hurried to open the door. Lord Wentworth stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand to Marguerite. She took it, her legs unsteady as she climbed down. The crowd of guests waiting outside the chapel turned to look at her, their faces a sea of curious eyes and painted smiles. "Remember," her father said quietly, positioning her hand on his arm. "Dignity. Grace. You were born for this." Marguerite nodded, lifting her chin and straightening her shoulders. She could do this. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As they walked toward the chapel entrance, she focused on keeping her steps measured and steady, on maintaining the serene expression she had practiced in front of the mirror 1,000 times. The chapel doors opened, and the sound of the organ swelled, filling the air with rich, triumphant music. The guests inside rose to their feet, turning to watch as Marguerite appeared in the doorway. She could see them all, row upon row of England's elite, dressed in their finest clothes, their faces eager with anticipation. And there, in the front pew on the right side, wearing a gown of deep crimson red that stood out like blood against the sea of pastels, sat Rose, Marguerite's younger sister. At 20 years old, Rose was everything Marguerite had been trained not to be. She was vivacious where Marguerite was composed, spontaneous where Marguerite was careful, warm where Marguerite was reserved. Where Marguerite's beauty was quiet and refined, Rose's was bright and impossible to ignore, with golden curls and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Their eyes met across the chapel, and Rose smiled. But it was not the supportive, sisterly smile Marguerite had hoped to see. There was something else in that smile, something that made the tightness in Marguerite's chest grow worse. A knowing look, a hint of triumph that Rose could not quite hide. Marguerite looked away quickly, focusing instead on the long aisle stretching before her. At the end of it, standing before the altar in his formal regalia, was Julian, the Duke of Claymore, her future husband, the man she had been promised to since birth. Forward, her father murmured, and they began to walk. Every eye in the chapel was on her. Every whisper fell silent as she moved down the aisle with measured steps, the train of her gown rustling against the stone floor. The music swelled around her, grand and powerful, but it seemed to come from very far away. Everything seemed distant suddenly, as though she were watching this moment happen to someone else. Julian stood waiting, his face turned toward her. But as Marguerite drew closer, she noticed something that sent ice through her veins. His expression was not one of joy or even polite pleasure. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold and distant, looking at her but not really seeing her. He looked like a man facing an unpleasant duty, not a bridegroom about to marry his chosen bride. Marguerite's steps faltered for just a moment, but her father's grip on her arm tightened, urging her forward. They reached the altar, and Lord Wentworth released her, stepping back to take his place beside her mother in the front pew. Marguerite stood before Julian, her bouquet clutched in her hands, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the chapel could hear it. The vicar opened his prayer book, clearing his throat to begin the ceremony that would bind them together forever. But before he could speak a single word, Julian raised his hand. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it stopped the vicar mid-breath. The chapel fell into an absolute, terrible silence. Marguerite stared at Julian, confusion and the first stirrings of real fear beginning to bloom in her chest. "Wait," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel. "I cannot do this." The silence that followed Julian's words was absolute and suffocating. Marguerite felt the world tilt beneath her feet, as though the stone floor of the chapel had suddenly turned to water. She stood frozen, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands, staring at the man who was supposed to become her husband. Julian would not meet her eyes. His gaze was fixed somewhere over her shoulder, his jaw set in a hard line. He looked like a man who had made a difficult decision and was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. "Your Grace," the vicar said hesitantly, his elderly face creased with confusion. "Perhaps we might proceed with the ceremony and discuss any concerns afterward." "No," Julian said, his voice cutting through the chapel with the force of a blade. "There will be no ceremony. I cannot marry Miss Wentworth." The gasps began then, rippling through the assembled guests like a stone thrown into still water. Marguerite heard them as if from a great distance, each sharp intake of breath another nail driven into her heart. She wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but her throat had closed completely. No words would come. Julian finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than anger or disgust. It was indifference, cold and complete, as though she were a stranger rather than the woman he had been bound to since childhood. "I apologize for the manner of this announcement," he continued, still speaking to her but somehow through her, as if she were made of glass. "But I find I cannot proceed with a marriage that was arranged without consideration for genuine feeling or mutual affection. I have come to realize that duty alone is not sufficient foundation for a lifelong union." Marguerite's mind struggled to make sense of his words. Duty alone? But their entire betrothal had been built on duty. That was what they had both always known, what they had both accepted. Why was he saying this now, in front of hundreds of witnesses, when they stood at the very altar where their vows should be spoken? "Then who?" Lord Wentworth's voice rang out from behind her, shaking with barely controlled rage. "Do you propose to marry, if not my daughter? The contract was signed by your father and witnessed by the crown. You cannot simply walk away from your obligations." Julian's expression did not change. He had clearly anticipated this question, had prepared for it. That realization made everything so much worse, because it meant this was not an impulsive decision made in a moment of panic. This was planned, calculated, deliberate. "I propose," Julian said slowly, his words falling like stones, "to marry Miss Rose Wentworth instead." The chapel erupted. The gasps turned to shocked exclamations, to whispers that grew louder and more frantic with each passing second. Marguerite heard none of it. She could only stare at Julian as the meaning of his words penetrated through the fog of disbelief that surrounded her. Rose. He wanted to marry Rose. "She has shown me warmth where there was duty," Julian continued, his voice rising to be heard over the growing chaos. "She has offered genuine affection where there was only obligation. In the months of preparation for this wedding, while Miss Marguerite Wentworth was occupied with her own arrangements, I had occasion to spend time with her sister. I found in Rose a spirit and a heart that spoke to my own. I found what a marriage should be built upon, something real rather than something written on paper 2 decades ago." Marguerite turned slowly, her body moving without conscious thought. She looked toward the front pew where her sister sat today. Rose had risen to her feet, and her face was exactly what Marguerite had feared it would be. There was triumph there, bright and undeniable, mixed with a performance of concern that was so transparently false it was almost laughable. "Oh, Marguerite," Rose said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sweetness she had perfected over the years. "I never meant for this to happen. Julian and I, we tried to fight what we felt, truly we did. But love cannot be denied." Love. The word hung in the air like poison. Rose had stolen her future and was calling it love. Lord Wentworth pushed past Marguerite, his face purple with rage. He strode directly to Julian, his finger raised in accusation. "This is a breach of contract," he thundered, his voice shaking the rafters. "A violation of an agreement made in good faith between our families. You shame your father's memory with this betrayal. You shame your title and your name." "The contract can be amended," Julian replied calmly, though his hands were clenched at his sides. "I am still marrying a daughter of the Wentworth family. The alliance remains intact. Only the specific terms require adjustment." "Adjustment?" Lord Wentworth's voice rose to a near shout. "You humiliate my eldest daughter in front of the entire realm and call it an adjustment? You break your word and expect us to simply accept this insult." But even as her father raged, even as the chapel dissolved into chaos around them, Marguerite knew the truth. Julian was the Duke of Claymore. He held power and influence that her father could never match. The contract could be challenged in court, certainly, but such battles took years and cost fortunes. And in the end, no court in England would force a duke to marry against his will, not when he was offering to marry another woman from the same family. Her father was fighting a battle that was already lost. Marguerite looked again at Rose, who had now moved to stand beside Julian. Her younger sister reached out and took the duke's hand, a gesture of possession that was meant to be seen by everyone present. Rose's golden curls gleamed in the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her crimson gown seemed to glow like fire against Julian's dark formal wear. They looked perfect together, Marguerite realized with a sickening lurch. They looked like what a duke and duchess should look like, bright and vivid and alive. While she, in her cream silk and careful composure, looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had been prepared for a role but had never truly been wanted for herself. The vicar was trying to restore order, his reedy voice calling for calm, but no one was listening. The guests were on their feet now, some scandalized, some thrilled by the drama unfolding before them. This would be talked about for years, Marguerite knew. This moment would become legend in drawing rooms across England. The day the Duke of Claymore rejected his promised bride at the altar for her younger sister. And she was at the center of it, standing in her wedding gown with her bouquet of roses, the living embodiment of humiliation and betrayal. Julian finally looked at her again, and this time there was something that might have been guilt in his eyes. But it was fleeting, quickly buried beneath his aristocratic composure. "I am sorry, Miss Wentworth," he said, and he might have even meant it. "But I cannot live a lie for the sake of duty. I hope you will understand, in time." Understand. As if understanding could repair what he had broken. As if understanding could give her back the future he had just torn away. Marguerite stood at the altar in her cream silk gown, surrounded by chaos, and felt something inside her shatter like glass. Inside, Marguerite was screaming. Inside, she was collapsing to the floor, tearing at her hair, demanding answers that would never satisfy. Inside, she was breaking into 1,000 pieces that could never be put back together. But outside, she was perfectly still. 23 years of training did not disappear in a moment, no matter how devastating. Every etiquette lesson, every lecture on composure, every reminder that a lady never showed her true feelings in public, all of it rose to the surface now like a shield. It was the only thing she had left, this practiced dignity, and she would not let them take it from her. Marguerite drew in one slow breath, then another. She felt her mind clear slightly, enough to think, enough to act. Her hands moved with steady precision as she set down her bouquet on the altar. The white roses lay there like a funeral arrangement. Then she reached for her left hand and carefully twisted the sapphire betrothal ring from her finger. Julian had given it to her 6 weeks ago during a formal dinner, slipping it onto her hand with all the emotion of a man completing a transaction. She had worn it every day since, growing used to its weight, to the way it caught the light. Now she held it between her fingers for a moment, looking at the deep blue stone that matched the Claymore family colors. Then she reached out and placed it in Julian's palm, her touch brief and cold. "I release you from your obligation to me," she said, her voice clear and steady. Not a tremor, not a crack. She would give them nothing to gossip about except her perfect composure. She turned to Rose, who was still standing beside Julian, still wearing that false expression of sympathy. Marguerite met her sister's eyes directly, and in a voice that carried through the chapel, she spoke her final words. "I wish you all the happiness you have clearly been seeking, Rose. May you find everything you deserve in this union." The subtle emphasis on the last word was her only revenge, a verbal blade delivered with a smile. Let those who were clever enough understand the true meaning behind her blessing. Then Marguerite turned away from them both and faced the long aisle that stretched before her. Every guest in the chapel was staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and barely concealed excitement at witnessing such a scandal. She lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and began to walk. Each step was measured and deliberate, her training carrying her forward when her heart wanted to run. The cream silk gown that should have been her triumph now marked her humiliation, its train dragging behind her like a weight. The whispers started as she passed, hissing through the pews like serpents. "Poor thing! How mortifying! Did you see her face? The sister, can you imagine?" Marguerite heard every word, felt every pitying glance like a physical touch, but she did not falter. She kept her eyes fixed on the chapel doors ahead, on the rectangle of spring sunlight that promised escape. Her hands hung at her sides, no longer clutching a bouquet, no longer wearing a ring. Empty, like her future. The walk seemed to last forever and no time at all. Finally, she reached the doors and passed through them into the morning air. Only then, with the chapel at her back and the world spreading out before her, did she allow herself to break. The carriage was waiting exactly where it had been left, the horses stamping impatiently, the driver looking confused by the early emergence of the bride. Alone. Without a groom. Tess appeared from somewhere behind Marguerite, her face stricken with shock and sympathy, and rushed to open the carriage door. Marguerite climbed inside, her movements still controlled, still measured. She arranged her skirts carefully, smoothed the silk with trembling hands, and sat perfectly upright on the velvet seat. The door closed. The carriage remained still, waiting for instruction. And then, finally alone, finally hidden from all those staring eyes and whispered judgments, Marguerite shattered. The sob that tore from her throat was raw and animal, a sound she had never made before in her life. Her hands flew to her face, pressing against her mouth as if she could push the sound back in, but it was too late. The dam had broken, and everything she had held back in the chapel came pouring out in great, heaving waves. She doubled over, her carefully styled hair coming loose from its pins, her veil tangling around her shoulders. The cream silk gown that had taken 8 months to create crumpled beneath her as she drew her knees up, making herself small, trying to disappear into the corner of the carriage. The door opened and Tess climbed in quickly, pulling it shut behind her. The maid's arms came around Marguerite immediately, holding her as she broke apart, murmuring wordless sounds of comfort that meant nothing and everything. "Miss Marguerite," Tess whispered, rocking her gently. "Oh, my dear girl." Marguerite could not speak. She could only weep, great tearing sobs that shook her entire body. 23 years of careful composure, of swallowed emotions and practiced smiles, all of it came undone in the darkness of the carriage. She cried for the future that had been stolen from her, for the humiliation she had endured, for the sister who had betrayed her and the man who had chosen someone else. But most of all, she cried because she did not know who she was anymore. Without the role of duchess, without the purpose she had been raised to fulfill, she was nothing. An empty shell in a cream silk gown. Time passed in a blur of tears and gasping breaths. Eventually, when her throat was raw and her eyes burned, when there seemed to be no tears left inside her, Marguerite slowly straightened. She pulled away from Tess and wiped at her face with shaking hands, knowing her carefully applied powder and rouge must be ruined, not caring anymore. "Where shall I tell the driver to go, miss?" Tess asked gently. "Back to Wentworth Hall?" "No." The word came out harsh and immediate. Marguerite could not face her father, could not bear to see the disappointment in his eyes, the anger at her failure to secure the match that was supposed to save their family's standing. She could not return to that house where every room held memories of preparing for a future that would never come. "Then where?" Tess pressed carefully. Marguerite drew in a shuddering breath, her mind racing through options. There was only one place she could think of, one person who might offer shelter without judgment. "Bath," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Take me to Aunt Helen's townhouse in Bath." Tess nodded and climbed out to give instructions to the driver. Moments later, the carriage lurched into motion, carrying Marguerite away from the chapel, away from the scandal, away from everything she had ever known. The journey to Bath took hours, the countryside rolling past the window in a blur of green and gold. Marguerite sat in silence, her tears finally spent, staring at nothing. Tess stayed close but did not try to make conversation. There was nothing to say that could make any of this better. By the time they reached the elegant townhouse on Queen Square, the sun was beginning its descent toward evening. Marguerite stepped down from the carriage on legs that felt like water, her ruined wedding gown drawing stares from passers-by. She did not care. Let them stare. Let them whisper. It could not possibly be worse than what she had already endured. Tess knocked on the door, and it was opened by Aunt Helen's butler, whose eyes widened at the sight of Marguerite in her wedding dress, her face blotchy and her hair half fallen down. "Miss Wentworth," he said, clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure. "We were not expecting you. Shall I announce you to Mrs. Prescott?" But before he could finish, Aunt Helen herself appeared in the hallway behind him. She was a tall woman in her late 40s, with graying auburn hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been widowed young and had chosen to remain unmarried, living independently on the fortune her late husband had left her. Society whispered about her unconventional choices, but Aunt Helen had never cared much for society's opinions. Those sharp eyes took in Marguerite's appearance in an instant, understanding everything without needing explanation. Her face softened with immediate compassion, and she pushed past her butler with her arms already outstretched. "Oh, my dear child," she said, pulling Marguerite into an embrace that was firm and warm and solid. "Come inside. Come in at once." Marguerite went willingly, gratefully, collapsing into her aunt's arms the way she had collapsed in the carriage. But this time, the tears that came were quieter, less violent. These were tears of relief at finding shelter, at not having to face the world alone. Aunt Helen held her niece tightly, one hand stroking her tangled hair, and looked over Marguerite's shoulder at Tess with a questioning expression. "The Duke chose her sister instead," Tess said quietly, her own voice thick with emotion. "At the altar. In front of everyone." Aunt Helen's entire body went rigid. When she spoke, her voice was low and dangerous in a way Marguerite had never heard before. "That weak-willed coward," she said, each word sharp as cut glass. "That absolute wretch of a man. And Rose?" She pulled back slightly to look at Marguerite's face. "Your sister did this?" Marguerite nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "A viper in silk," Aunt Helen declared coldly. "That is what she is and what she has always been. Come, darling. Let us get you out of this dress and into a bath. Then we shall talk about what happens next." She guided Marguerite up the stairs with one arm around her waist, supporting her weight as though she were an invalid. And perhaps she was, in a way. The Marguerite who had entered that chapel this morning no longer existed. She had been destroyed at the altar, and whoever emerged from this catastrophe would be someone entirely new. For now, though, she had sanctuary. She had her aunt's fierce protection and a place to hide from the scandal that would surely be raging through London society by nightfall. It was not much, but it was something. It was enough. 3 days passed in a haze of grief and exhaustion. Marguerite remained in the guest chamber Aunt Helen had given her, taking meals in her room, speaking to no one except Tess and her aunt. She slept fitfully, waking often from dreams where she was walking down the aisle again, over and over, each time arriving at the altar to find Julian turning away. The letters began arriving on the second day. Her father's was first, filled with fury and demands that she return home immediately. Her mother's followed, laden with disappointment and worry about what society would say. There were notes from friends, some offering sympathy, others thinly veiled requests for details about the scandal. Marguerite read none of them past the first few lines. Aunt Helen took them all away and dealt with the responses herself. On the morning of the fourth day, Aunt Helen entered Marguerite's chamber carrying a tea tray and wearing an expression that suggested she would not be leaving until they had talked. "Enough hiding," she announced, setting the tray on the bedside table with a decisive clink of china. "You have wallowed sufficiently. Now we must speak plainly about what has happened and what comes next." Marguerite sat up slowly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had not bothered to dress properly since arriving, living in nightgowns and dressing robes like an invalid. "I do not know what there is to say, Aunt Helen," she said quietly. "My life is ruined. Everything I was raised for, everything I prepared for, it is all gone." Aunt Helen poured tea with steady hands and passed a cup to Marguerite before settling into the chair beside the bed. Her sharp eyes studied her niece with a mixture of compassion and something harder, something that looked almost like determination. "Let me tell you something about that marriage contract," Aunt Helen said, her voice firm. "It was a gilded prison, nothing more. Beautiful on the outside, cold and confining within. You have spent your entire life preparing to be locked inside it, and now Julian has handed you the key to walk free." Marguerite shook her head, her fingers tight around the teacup. "You do not understand. I have no purpose now. I was meant to be a duchess, to manage estates and host dinners and raise heirs. Without that role, what am I? Nothing. Just another unmarried woman living on charity." "You are wrong." Aunt Helen leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge. "You are Marguerite Wentworth, intelligent and accomplished, capable of far more than smiling prettily at dinner parties and producing sons for a man who never truly saw you. Tell me honestly, my dear, did you love Julian Harrington?" The question hung in the air between them. Marguerite opened her mouth to say yes, to insist that she had loved him, but the word would not come. She sat in silence, the teacup cooling in her hands, and truly considered the question for the first time. "I do not know," she finally whispered. "I thought I did. I believed I could grow to love him. But Aunt Helen, I barely knew him. We met perhaps a dozen times over the years, always with chaperones, always in formal settings. Our conversations were about the weather and books we had read and estate business. I knew what he looked like, what he sounded like when discussing crop rotations, but I did not know what made him laugh or what he dreamed about or what frightened him." "Precisely," Aunt Helen said, setting down her own cup. "You were in love with the idea of being the Duchess of Claymore. You loved the role, the title, the purpose it gave you. But Julian himself? He was just the man attached to the position, interchangeable with any other duke who might have been chosen for you." The words struck Marguerite like a physical blow because they were true. She had spent hours imagining herself presiding over Claymore House, planning menus and managing servants, hosting grand balls where everyone would admire her grace and elegance. She had pictured herself as a duchess in every detail. But when she tried to imagine quiet moments alone with Julian, intimate conversations by the fire, growing old together and truly knowing each other, she found only empty space. "What does that make me?" Marguerite asked, her voice breaking. "If I never truly loved him, if I only wanted the title, does that make me as shallow as everyone will surely say I am?" "It makes you human," Aunt Helen replied gently. "It makes you a woman who was raised from birth to fulfill a specific purpose and who accepted that purpose without question because you were never given any other choice. But now, painful as it is, you have been given a choice. The question is what you will do with it." Marguerite set down her teacup with shaking hands. "I do not even know what choices exist. I have spent my entire life preparing for one single future. Then it is time you learned about other possibilities." Aunt Helen stood and moved to the door, gesturing for Marguerite to follow. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Still in her dressing robe, Marguerite followed her aunt down the hallway and down the stairs to the ground floor. Aunt Helen led her to a set of double doors at the back of the house and pushed them open with a flourish. The library was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with more books than Marguerite had ever seen in a private home. Leather-bound volumes of every size and color, their spines gleaming in the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. A reading desk stood in one corner, covered with papers and open books. Comfortable chairs were scattered throughout, inviting long hours of study and reflection. "This is where I have spent most of my life since my husband died," Aunt Helen said, moving into the room with obvious affection. "This is where I discovered who I was beyond being a wife, beyond being what others expected me to be. These books taught me that there are women who think and write and argue and change the world. Women who refuse to accept the limitations society placed upon them." She pulled a slim volume from a shelf and handed it to Marguerite. "Start with this one. Mary Wollstonecraft. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She wrote it more than 50 years ago, but every word is still true today." Marguerite took the book carefully, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. She had heard of Wollstonecraft, of course, but only in whispers, only as a cautionary tale of what happened to women who had radical ideas. "Read," Aunt Helen urged. "Think. Question everything you have been taught about what you should be and what you should want. This is your chance, Marguerite, perhaps your only chance, to discover who you truly are beneath all those years of training and expectations. Do not waste it mourning a future that would have buried you alive." Marguerite opened the book to the first page and began to read. The words were challenging, even confrontational, arguing that women were not naturally inferior to men but had been made so by lack of education and opportunity. That the qualities society valued in women, meekness and dependence and decorative accomplishment, were not virtues but chains. She read for hours, curled in one of the comfortable chairs while Aunt Helen worked quietly at her desk. When one book ended, she reached for another. Catherine Macaulay, Hannah More, even some French philosophers whose ideas had been translated into English. Ideas she had never been exposed to, thoughts she had never been permitted to think. And slowly, very slowly, something began to shift inside her. The grief was still there, the humiliation still burned, but beneath it, something new was taking root. A question she had never asked herself before. What did Marguerite Wentworth want for herself, if the choice was truly hers to make? 6 weeks passed in the sanctuary of Aunt Helen's townhouse. Marguerite spent her days in the library, reading voraciously, filling her mind with ideas and perspectives that had been carefully kept from her during her years of duchess training. She read philosophy and political theory, poetry and essays, histories written by women whose names had been deliberately omitted from her education. The grief was still there, a constant ache beneath everything else, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the raw, tearing pain of those first days but something quieter, more manageable. She still woke sometimes from dreams of the chapel, still felt the flush of humiliation when she thought of all those staring faces, but increasingly she found herself thinking less about what she had lost and more about what might still be possible. Letters continued to arrive. Her father had stopped writing after Aunt Helen sent a particularly firm response to his demands. Her mother's notes came weekly, full of worry and gentle pleas for Marguerite to come home, to face society, to begin the work of repairing her reputation. There were occasional messages from former friends, though many had gone conspicuously silent, clearly uncertain how to address a woman involved in such a scandal. And then there were the letters about Julian and Rose. Society gossip traveled quickly, even to Bath, and Aunt Helen made no effort to shield Marguerite from the news. The wedding had taken place 3 weeks after the chapel disaster, a much smaller affair than the grand ceremony that had been planned. Rose was now the Duchess of Claymore, presiding over the estates Marguerite had spent years learning to manage. The reports suggested she was performing the role adequately, though with far more attention to fashion and entertainment than to the practical matters of running a ducal household. Marguerite had expected these updates to wound her deeply, but instead she felt a strange sort of distance, as though reading about people she had once known but no longer had any connection to. That life, that future, belonged to someone else now. The question was what life belonged to her. It was during breakfast on a Tuesday morning that Aunt Helen made her announcement. "You cannot hide forever," she said, setting down her teacup with a decisive click. "It has been 6 weeks, and while I am perfectly content to keep you here indefinitely, you will eventually need to face the world again. Better to do it on your own terms than to wait until you are forced." Marguerite looked up from the book she had been reading, a collection of essays on education reform. "I am not ready." "You will never feel ready," Aunt Helen replied matter-of-factly. "But Lady Georgiana Cavendish is hosting a gathering at her country estate this weekend. A small affair, perhaps 30 guests, mostly intellectuals and artists. Philosophers, writers, musicians. People who care more about ideas than gossip. It would be a gentle re-entry into society." The thought of facing people again, of walking into a room where everyone would know her story, made Marguerite's stomach clench with anxiety. But she also knew her aunt was right. She could not stay hidden in this library forever, no matter how safe it felt. "Will they all be staring at me?" she asked quietly. "Whispering about what happened?" "Some will," Aunt Helen admitted. "But Lady Georgiana's guests are not the usual society crowd. They are too interested in their own debates and discussions to spend much time dwelling on romantic scandals. And I will be with you every moment. At the first sign that you are uncomfortable, we will leave." Marguerite drew in a slow breath and closed her book. "Very well. I will go." The journey to Lady Georgiana's estate took most of a day, the countryside rolling past in shades of summer green and gold. Marguerite watched through the carriage window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. She wore a dress of deep blue silk, elegant but understated, with none of the elaborate decorations that had marked her wedding gown. Her hair was arranged simply, without the complicated curls and pins that Tess had labored over on that terrible morning in May. She looked different than she had 6 weeks ago, she knew. Older perhaps, or at least changed in some fundamental way. The woman who had stood at that altar had been carefully constructed over 23 years to be someone's wife. The woman who existed now was still being discovered, still taking shape. Lady Georgiana's estate was beautiful, an old manor house surrounded by gardens and ancient trees. Carriages lined the drive, and Marguerite could hear voices and laughter drifting from the open windows. Her anxiety spiked sharply, and she nearly asked Aunt Helen if they could turn back, but then the carriage stopped and the door was opening and there was no more time for hesitation. They were greeted warmly by Lady Georgiana herself, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of comfortable authority. If she knew about Marguerite's scandal, and surely she must, she gave no sign of it. She welcomed them both with genuine pleasure and led them through the house to a spacious drawing room where guests had already gathered. Marguerite's first impression was of how different this was from the society events she had attended before. There was no careful positioning by rank, no rigid adherence to social hierarchies. Instead, people were clustered in small groups throughout the room, engaged in animated conversations. A woman in a painting-stained smock was gesturing emphatically while discussing technique with a man who appeared to be sketching her as she spoke. Near the windows, 3 men were engaged in what sounded like a passionate debate about parliamentary reform. A young woman sat at the pianoforte, playing something complex and modern that Marguerite did not recognize. "You see?" Aunt Helen murmured beside her. These are not the people who will judge you for what happened. These are people who have ideas they care about more than gossip. As if to prove the point, a gentleman approached them with a warm smile, introducing himself as a poet recently returned from Italy. He asked Marguerite what she thought of the Romantic movement, and when she hesitantly shared her opinion, he engaged with her thoughts seriously, as though her perspective mattered. No one asked about Julian. No one mentioned the wedding. Instead, they talked about literature and art, about politics and philosophy, about ideas. Marguerite found herself relaxing slightly, drawn into a discussion about education reform with two women who ran a school for girls. She was offering her own thoughts, formed from her weeks of reading in Aunt Helen's library, when she became aware of someone watching her. She turned and found herself meeting the gaze of a man standing near the fireplace. He was tall, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and eyes that seemed to take in everything with quiet intelligence. He was dressed simply but elegantly in the French style, and there was something in his bearing that suggested both confidence and genuine curiosity. Their eyes held for a moment, and Marguerite felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. Then Lady Georgiana was beside her, making introductions. "Miss Wentworth, may I present Monsieur Philippe Bellefontaine, the Duke of Lyon. He is visiting from France and has been fascinating us all with his perspective on French philosophy. Sir Bellefontaine, this is Miss Marguerite Wentworth and her aunt, Mrs. Helen Prescott." The Duke of Lyon. Marguerite felt a momentary panic at the title, remembering another duke, another introduction that had led to disaster. But Sir Bellefontaine's bow was graceful and his smile was warm without being presumptuous. "It is a pleasure to meet you both," he said, his English flawless though marked with a slight French accent that softened the edges of his words. "I overheard part of your conversation about education. I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I found your arguments quite compelling." "Which arguments?" Marguerite asked, surprised into directness. "Your point about how women are taught accomplishments rather than encouraged to develop their intellects," he replied. "You suggested that if women were given the same educational opportunities as men, society would benefit from a fuller range of perspectives and talents. I agree completely. It is something I have tried to implement in my own region, with schools that teach both boys and girls." For the next hour, Marguerite found herself engaged in the most stimulating conversation she had ever experienced. Sir Bellefontaine did not treat her as an ornament to be admired or a curiosity to be indulged. He spoke to her as an equal, asking her opinions and genuinely listening to her answers. They discussed Rousseau's ideas about natural education, debated the merits of various English poets, argued pleasantly about whether progress was inevitable or required active intervention. "You have clearly read widely," Sir Bellefontaine observed at one point, his expression one of open admiration. "It is refreshing to meet someone who engages with ideas rather than simply accepting what they are told." Marguerite felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she slowly recognized as pride. Not the careful, performed pride of having mastered duchess skills, but genuine pleasure at being recognized for her own thoughts and intelligence. "I have had a good teacher," she said, glancing at Aunt Helen, who was watching from nearby with an expression of satisfaction. "And access to an excellent library." "Books are dangerous things," Sir Bellefontaine said with a slight smile. "They give people ideas about who they might become rather than who they are told to be." Something in the way he said it made Marguerite suspect he understood more about her situation than he was letting on. But there was no pity in his eyes, no judgment. Only interest and a kind of recognition, as though he saw in her something worth knowing. As the afternoon turned to evening and dinner was announced, Marguerite realized something remarkable. 4 hours, she had not thought about Julian or Rose or the chapel. She had not worried about being stared at or whispered about. She had simply been herself, engaged in conversation that challenged and excited her, speaking her own thoughts without fear of being too opinionated or too intellectual or too anything. And Sir Bellefontaine, this French duke with thoughtful eyes and genuine interest in what she had to say, had made her feel something she had never felt with Julian despite all those years of formal courtship. For the first time in her life, Marguerite Wentworth felt truly seen. The weeks that followed Lady Georgiana's gathering unfolded like the turning of pages in a book Marguerite had not known she was waiting to read. Sir Bellefontaine remained in England, his original plans to return to France postponed for reasons he did not fully explain but which Marguerite suspected had something to do with her. They encountered each other frequently at the intellectual gatherings Aunt Helen favored, at garden parties hosted by progressive families, at museum exhibitions and lecture halls. Always, Aunt Helen was present as chaperone, though she had a talent for positioning herself close enough to be proper but far enough to allow genuine conversation. Marguerite was grateful for her aunt's understanding, for the way she facilitated these meetings without making them feel arranged or forced. It was different from the courtship with Julian, if one could even call those formal, supervised visits a courtship. With Julian, every meeting had been orchestrated around the marriage contract, every conversation carefully steered towards safe topics that would not challenge or provoke. She had been performing the role of future duchess, and he had been performing the role of suitable husband, and neither of them had ever truly stepped outside those prescribed parts. With Philippe, there were no roles to perform. There was simply conversation, genuine and unguarded, about things that mattered. They met one afternoon at the Botanical Gardens, walking along paths lined with roses while Aunt Helen followed at a discreet distance. Philippe spoke of the Lyonnese region with obvious love, describing the vineyards that covered the hillsides, the way the light fell across the Rhône River at sunset, the small villages where families had lived for generations. "It is not the grandest duchy in France," he admitted, his hands clasped behind his back as they walked. "But it is mine, and I have worked to make it a place where people can thrive rather than merely survive. We have established schools in every village, not just for the wealthy but for everyone. We have reformed the tenant farming practices to give families more security and better returns on their labor." Marguerite listened with growing admiration. This was so different from how Julian spoke of his estates, which had always been in terms of profit margins and social prestige rather than the actual people who lived and worked there. "Do your fellow nobles approve of such reforms?" she asked. Philippe smiled ruefully. "Most think I am either dangerously radical or hopelessly naive. But I believe that a society is only as strong as its weakest members. When we lift people up rather than keeping them down, everyone benefits. It is not charity. It is simply good sense and basic human decency." Another afternoon found them at the British Museum, examining the collection of Greek sculptures. Philippe stood before a marble statue of Athena, goddess of wisdom, and spoke thoughtfully about how ancient civilizations had valued female intelligence in ways that modern society had seemingly forgotten. "The Greeks understood that wisdom was not the province of men alone," he said. "Yet somehow we have decided that women should be decorative rather than thoughtful, accomplished in trivial pursuits rather than educated in substantive ones. It is a tremendous waste of human potential." Marguerite felt emboldened by his words to share thoughts she had never voiced before. "I was raised to be a perfect duchess. I can plan a menu for 40 guests, arrange flowers to match any color scheme, play the pianoforte well enough to entertain but not so well as to seem competitive. But no one ever asked me what I thought about governance or justice or how society might be improved. Those were not considered appropriate topics for a future duchess." "Then they were fools," Philippe said simply, turning to look at her with those thoughtful dark eyes. "Because I have found in our conversations that you have more insight into such matters than half the men in Parliament. Your perspectives are valuable precisely because they come from a different experience, a different understanding of how the world functions. The warmth that spread through Marguerite at his words was unlike anything she had felt before. It was not the dutiful pleasure of receiving a compliment on her appearance or her accomplishments. It was the profound satisfaction of being recognized for her mind, her thoughts, her actual self. They attended a philosophical discussion at a private salon, where a visiting scholar was presenting ideas about social reform. Afterward, walking back to Aunt Helen's townhouse in the soft evening light, Philippe asked Marguerite what she had thought of the arguments presented. She found herself speaking passionately, her words flowing freely as she articulated ideas she had not fully realized she held. She talked about education and opportunity, about how talent was distributed equally across all classes but access to development was not, about how society could benefit if it valued character and capability over birth and gender. Philippe listened intently, occasionally asking questions that pushed her thinking further, never once suggesting that her opinions were too radical or inappropriate for a lady. When she finally paused, slightly breathless from her own eloquence, he was smiling. "You have discovered your voice," he said softly. "It is a beautiful thing to witness." "I did not know I had one," Marguerite admitted. "Or perhaps I knew, but I had been taught to keep it silent." "Then I am grateful to whoever or whatever gave you permission to speak," Philippe replied. "Because the world is better for hearing what you have to say." As the weeks passed, Marguerite found herself laughing more than she had in years, perhaps more than she ever had. Philippe had a dry wit and a gift for finding humor in unexpected places. He told stories about diplomatic disasters in the French court, about his own youthful mistakes when first taking over his duchy, about the various absurdities of aristocratic life that he observed with an outsider's bemused perspective. With him, Marguerite could be clever without being sharp, funny without being unladylike, honest without being improper. She discovered passions she had not known she possessed. She found herself caring deeply about social reform, about education, about the way society limited people based on arbitrary circumstances of birth. She realized she had opinions about art and music that went beyond what was fashionable. She discovered she enjoyed debating ideas, testing arguments, being intellectually challenged rather than merely agreeable. One evening, as they stood in Aunt Helen's garden watching the sun set over Bath, Philippe spoke quietly about his own past. "I was engaged once, you know," he said. "An arrangement made by my father before he died. The lady was perfectly suitable by all society's standards. Beautiful, accomplished, from an excellent family. But we had nothing to say to each other beyond pleasantries. I broke the engagement and faced considerable criticism for it. My mother was furious. Society called me ungrateful and irresponsible." "But you do not regret it," Marguerite said. "It was not a question." "Not for a moment," he confirmed. "Because I believed then, and I believe now, that marriage should be a partnership of equals. It should be built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not on contracts and family alliances. I would rather remain unmarried than spend my life with someone I could not truly know." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes Marguerite saw something that made her breath catch. Not the cold assessment she had seen in Julian's gaze, not the calculating interest of a man evaluating a suitable wife. But warmth and genuine feeling, the look of someone who saw her and valued what he saw. "Character matters more than lineage," Philippe said softly. "And you, Marguerite Wentworth, have more character than anyone I have ever met." For the first time since the chapel, since that terrible morning that had shattered her carefully constructed future, Marguerite felt something bloom in her chest that was not grief or anger or loss. It was hope, fragile and new, but undeniably real. The invitation arrived on a morning in early August, 3 months after the chapel disaster that had changed everything. Heavy cream paper embossed with the Cromwell family crest, requesting the pleasure of Miss Marguerite Wentworth's company at a grand ball to be held at Lord Byron Cromwell's London residence. Marguerite held it carefully, reading the elegant script twice to be certain she understood what it meant. This would be the first major society event of the season, the kind of gathering where everyone who mattered would be present, including, undoubtedly, the Duke and Duchess of Claymore making their first significant public appearance as a married couple. "You do not have to go," Aunt Helen said from across the breakfast table, watching her niece's face carefully. "No one would blame you for declining." But that was not entirely true, and they both knew it. Declining would look like hiding, like being unable to face society, like admitting defeat. Marguerite had spent 3 months rebuilding herself, discovering who she was beyond the role she had been raised to fill. If she hid now, all of that work would mean nothing. "I will go," Marguerite said, setting down the invitation with steady hands. "But not alone." When she asked Philippe if he would escort her, his response was immediate and unhesitating. "It would be my honor," he said simply. "And if at any moment you wish to leave, we will leave. You need prove nothing to anyone." The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable rain, the kind of summer storm that turned London's streets into rivers and made carriages splash through puddles. Marguerite dressed with care in a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the auburn in her hair. It was not the color of a modest wallflower hoping to blend into the background, but neither was it the bold statement of someone seeking attention. It was simply beautiful, elegant, and entirely her own choice. Tess arranged her hair in a style that was fashionable but understated, with small pearls woven through the dark curls. When Marguerite looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone different from the woman who had stood in a cream silk wedding gown 3 months ago. This woman had opinions and passions, thoughts and dreams that belonged to no one but herself. This woman had chosen her own path. Lord Cromwell's London residence was ablaze with light when they arrived, every window glowing, music and laughter spilling out into the rain-soaked night. Philippe handed her down from the carriage with a reassuring smile, Aunt Helen following close behind. Together, the 3 of them climbed the steps and entered the grand ballroom. The effect of Marguerite's entrance was immediate. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned. Whispers began like a wave spreading across water. She felt the weight of every stare, every curious and judgmental gaze, but she kept her chin high and her expression serene. She had learned in the past 3 months that dignity was not about never feeling afraid, but about refusing to let fear control you. "They are staring because you are beautiful and they are small-minded gossips," Philippe murmured beside her, his hand steady under hers. "Pay them no mind." They moved through the ballroom, greeting acquaintances, engaging in brief conversations. Some people were kind, expressing genuine pleasure at seeing Marguerite out in society again. Others were coolly polite, their eyes sharp with curiosity about the scandal. And some, thankfully few, were openly disdainful, as though being rejected at the altar were a moral failing rather than a cruel circumstance. Marguerite handled each interaction with practiced grace, neither apologizing for her presence nor pretending nothing had happened. She was simply there, and she had every right to be. And then, across the ballroom, she saw them. Julian and Rose stood near the orchestra, the center of a small crowd of admirers. Rose wore a gown of white satin covered in silver embroidery that must have cost a fortune, her golden curls piled high and decorated with diamonds. She was laughing at something one of the guests had said, her hand possessively on Julian's arm. Julian himself looked much as he always had, handsome and aristocratic in his formal attire, smiling with that practiced charm that had once made Marguerite believe he might care for her. They looked, she had to admit, like the perfect Duke and Duchess. Beautiful and wealthy and exactly what society expected such a couple to be. Marguerite felt Philippe tense slightly beside her, ready to guide her away if she wished, but she shook her head minutely. She was not afraid of seeing them. In fact, she felt remarkably little beyond a distant sort of curiosity, as though looking at characters in a story that no longer concerned her. "Shall we dance?" Philippe asked, and Marguerite accepted gratefully. They moved onto the floor as a waltz began, and for several minutes Marguerite lost herself in the movement and the music. Philippe was an excellent dancer, leading her with easy confidence, and she found herself smiling genuinely as they turned and swayed among the other couples. "You are handling this remarkably well," he observed. "I am surprising myself," Marguerite admitted. "I thought seeing them would hurt more than it does. But mostly I just feel grateful that I am here with you instead of standing beside him pretending to be happy in a marriage built on duty rather than choice." When the dance ended, Philippe escorted her to the refreshment table where Aunt Helen was waiting with glasses of champagne. They stood together, talking quietly, when Marguerite noticed Julien approaching through the crowd. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her expression calm. "Miss Wentworth," Julien said as he reached them, offering a formal bow. "Might I have a word with you in private?" Marguerite glanced at Philippe, who looked ready to refuse on her behalf, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It is all right," she said quietly. "I can handle this." She allowed Julien to guide her away from the ballroom into a quieter gallery lined with portraits of the Cromwell ancestors. The sounds of the ball faded to a distant murmur, leaving them in relative privacy. Julien stood before her, and for the first time since that terrible morning, Marguerite truly looked at him without the filter of expectation or duty. He seemed smaller somehow, less impressive than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply grown larger, more substantial in her own right. "I owe you an explanation," Julien began, his voice stiff and formal. "What happened at the chapel, the manner in which I handled it, was inexcusable. I have spent these past months regretting the pain I caused you." Marguerite said nothing, simply waited for him to continue. She noticed the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the tightness around his eyes. He was nervous, she realized. This powerful duke was actually nervous speaking to her. "The truth is that Rose made me feel something I had never felt with you," he continued, the words coming faster now. "She made me feel desired, wanted for myself rather than for my title. With you, everything was always so proper, so dutiful. You never showed passion or spontaneity. You were perfect in every way, but you never made me feel like I was anything more than a role you were obligated to fill." And there it was. The insecurity beneath the aristocratic bearing. He had not chosen Rose because he loved her, but because she had made him feel powerful and desirable in a way that Marguerite's careful composure never had. He had needed validation, proof of his own appeal beyond his title, and Rose had provided that performance. Marguerite felt a sudden clarity, a perfect understanding of exactly what had happened and why. Julien was not a villain. He was simply a weak man who had made a selfish choice and was now seeking absolution for it. "Julien," she said, interrupting what was clearly going to be a longer speech. Her voice was calm, even kind. "You do not owe me an explanation." He blinked, clearly taken aback. "But I do. What I did was unforgivable." "Perhaps it was," Marguerite agreed. "But I forgive you anyway, not because you deserve it but because I no longer wish to carry anger toward you. You made a choice based on your own needs and insecurities. You wanted to feel desired rather than dutiful. I understand that now, and honestly, I am grateful." "Grateful?" Julien looked genuinely confused. "Yes," Marguerite said, and she realized it was true. "Because if you had married me out of obligation, we both would have been miserable. I would have spent my life performing the role of duchess while slowly losing myself, and you would have spent yours resenting me for not being spontaneous enough, passionate enough, whatever it was you thought you needed. We would have made each other profoundly unhappy." She took a breath, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. Rose makes you feel powerful. She performs the role of adoring wife in a way that flatters your pride. I hope for both your sakes that there is something real beneath that performance, but either way, it is no longer my concern. You have changed, Julian said quietly, something like wonder in his voice. Yes, I have, Marguerite agreed. I discovered that I am more than the role I was raised to fill. I have thoughts and passions and opinions that matter. I have found someone who values those things rather than wanting me to hide them. So thank you, Julian, for setting me free to discover who I actually am. She turned to leave, but Julian's voice stopped her. The Frenchman? The Duke of Lyon? You care for him? Marguerite looked back over her shoulder, a small smile playing at her lips. Yes, I do. Genuinely and authentically, in a way I never cared for you. Not because of his title or his wealth or what marrying him would mean for my social standing, but because of who he is as a person. That is the difference between duty and choice. She left him standing in the gallery and walked back into the ballroom with her head high and her heart light. She had faced the man who had humiliated her, and instead of being diminished by the encounter, she felt stronger. She had offered him forgiveness and understanding, not because he deserved it but because she deserved to be free of anger. Philippe was waiting where she had left him, his eyes searching her face with concern. When he saw her expression, relief and something warmer flooded his features. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am better than all right," Marguerite replied. "I am free." "Then will you dance with me again?" Philippe asked, offering his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. "And let all of London see that you have chosen your own path." Marguerite placed her hand in his without hesitation. They moved onto the dance floor together, and this time Marguerite was aware of every eye watching them, every whisper that followed in their wake. But instead of shrinking from the attention, she met it with quiet confidence. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She was no longer the woman rejected by the Duke of Claymore. She was Marguerite Wentworth, a woman who had discovered her own voice and chosen her own future. And the man who held her now, who looked at her with genuine affection and respect, had chosen her in return. As they danced beneath the glittering chandeliers, Marguerite felt something she had never felt in all her years of preparing to be Julian's duchess. She felt joy. 2 weeks after the ball, on a September morning when the gardens of Aunt Helen's townhouse were heavy with the scent of late roses, Philippe asked Marguerite to walk with him. Aunt Helen watched from the drawing-room window with a knowing smile, making no move to follow as chaperone. Some moments, her expression seemed to say, were meant to be private. They walked in comfortable silence at first, following the gravel paths between flower beds that were beginning to show the first signs of autumn. The air was crisp and clear, the sky that particular shade of blue that only came in early fall. Marguerite felt peaceful in a way she had never experienced before, content simply to be in this moment without worrying about what came next. Philippe stopped beside a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, its leaves just beginning to turn gold at the edges. He took both of Marguerite's hands in his expression serious but warm. "I have never been a man who believed in fate," he began, his accent making the words sound like poetry. "I have always thought that we create our own futures through the choices we make. But meeting you, Marguerite, has made me wonder if perhaps some things are meant to be." Marguerite's heart began to beat faster, understanding what was coming but needing to hear the words spoken. "I came to England with no intention of falling in love," Philippe continued. "I planned to stay a few weeks, attend some gatherings, then return to Lyon. But then I met you, and everything changed. You challenged my thinking, made me laugh, showed me what it means to truly know another person beyond social masks and practiced performances." He squeezed her hands gently, his eyes holding hers with absolute sincerity. I am not offering you a contract or an alliance or a duty to fulfill. I am offering you a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. I am offering you a life where you can be exactly who you are, where your thoughts and opinions matter, where your passions are celebrated rather than suppressed. I am offering you my heart, freely given, with no expectations beyond hoping that you might offer yours in return. Marguerite Wentworth, will you marry me? Not because you were promised to me, not because it benefits your family or secures your future, but simply because you choose to. Because you want to build a life together based on authentic love rather than obligation. Tears pricked at Marguerite's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. This proposal was everything the first one had never been. This was choice and freedom and genuine feeling. This was a man who saw her completely and loved what he saw. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, Philippe. I choose you. I choose this. I choose a future that I help create rather than one that was written for me before I was old enough to understand what it meant. He smiled then, brilliant and unguarded, and pulled her into an embrace that was tender and respectful and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, both of them laughing slightly at their own emotion, Marguerite felt as though she had finally found the place where she belonged. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in a small chapel near Bath. There were no hundreds of guests, no elaborate decorations, no performative display of wealth and status. Instead, there were perhaps 30 people who genuinely cared about the bride and groom. Aunt Helen stood beside Marguerite as matron of honor, her eyes bright with proud tears. A handful of Philippe's closest friends had traveled from France. Lady Georgiana attended, along with several others from the intellectual circle that had become Marguerite's true community. Notably absent were Marguerite's parents and most of her former society acquaintances. Lord Wentworth had sent a stiff letter expressing his disappointment that she was marrying a foreign duke rather than returning home to repair her reputation through a more suitable English match. Her mother had been warmer but still concerned about what people would say. Rose had not written at all. Marguerite felt no grief at their absence. The people who truly mattered, who loved her for herself rather than for the role she could fill, were all present. That was enough. When she walked down the aisle in a simple gown of ivory silk, carrying a bouquet of lavender and roses from Aunt Helen's garden, Marguerite felt only joy. And when she reached Philippe at the altar, when she saw the love and respect in his eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this was right. This was real. This was chosen. 6 months later, Marguerite stood at the window of her chambers in the Château de Lyon, looking out over the vineyards that stretched toward distant hills. The winter sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and she could hear Philippe's voice drifting up from the courtyard below as he discussed crop rotations with their estate manager. The Duche du Lyonnais was beautiful in a way that was completely different from the English countryside she had grown up in. The landscape was wilder here, more dramatic, with mountains visible in the distance and the Rhône River cutting through the valley like a silver ribbon. The chateau itself was ancient stone and graceful architecture, filled with light and warmth and the kind of comfortable elegance that came from generations of careful stewardship rather than ostentatious display. Marguerite had taken to her new life with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. She spent her mornings working alongside Philippe on estate management, learning about the vineyards and the tenant farms, meeting with village leaders to discuss education and infrastructure improvements. Her afternoons were often devoted to reading and writing, working on essays about social reform that Philippe encouraged her to share with progressive thinkers in both France and England. She had discovered passions she never knew existed. She loved the practical work of improving people's lives, of seeing the direct impact of good governance and fair treatment. She loved the intellectual stimulation of debating ideas with Philippe and their friends, of being challenged to think deeper and argue better. She loved the simple freedom of being herself without apology or pretense. Most of all, she loved the partnership she had built with Philippe. They made decisions together, valued each other's perspectives, supported each other's goals. When they disagreed, which happened regularly given their both strong personalities, they argued respectfully and usually found compromise or common ground. When they agreed, they moved forward as a united force. This was what marriage should be, Marguerite had come to understand. Not one person subordinate to another, not duty without affection, but two individuals choosing daily to build something together. She settled at the writing desk in her chamber and pulled out fresh paper and ink. She had been meaning to write to Aunt Helen for days, wanting to share how settled and happy she had become. "My dearest Aunt Helen," she began, her hand steady as she formed the words. "I write to you from Lyon with a heart full of gratitude. You taught me that a broken promise can become an open door, that what I thought was my greatest failure was actually the beginning of my truest life." She paused, thinking of that terrible morning in May when her carefully constructed future had shattered in the chapel. If someone had told her then that she would one day be grateful for Julian's rejection, she would have thought them cruel or mad. But now, sitting in her French chateau with the sunset painting the sky outside and her chosen husband's voice a comforting sound below, she understood that it was true. "If Julian had married me as planned," she continued writing, "I would never have discovered who I truly was beneath all those years of training and expectation. I would never have learned that I had thoughts worth sharing, passions worth pursuing, a voice worth raising. I would never have found a man who loved me for myself rather than for a contract signed over my cradle. You showed me that I could choose my own path, that I was more than the role I was raised to fill. That gift is worth more than any title or position society might have given me. I am the Duchess of Lyon now, but more importantly, I am simply Marguerite, fully and authentically myself for perhaps the first time in my life." She wrote for several more minutes, sharing details of her work in the villages, describing the chateau and the countryside, expressing her hope that Aunt Helen would visit in the spring. When she finally signed her name and sealed the letter, Marguerite felt a profound sense of peace. She had left England as a woman rejected and humiliated. She had arrived in France as a woman who chose her own destiny. The difference between those two versions of herself was everything. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Philippe entered with a smile. "There you are. I have been looking for you. Cook has prepared something special for dinner, and I thought we might eat by the fire and discuss the new school building plans." "That sounds perfect," Marguerite said, rising from her desk and crossing to him. He took her hand naturally, comfortably, the gesture of a man who loved touching his wife simply because he could. As they walked together down the corridor toward their private dining room, Marguerite reflected on how far she had come from that terrible morning in the chapel. She had been promised to the Duke of Claymore, and he had chosen her sister instead. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything. But it had been, she now understood, simply the beginning of a better story. If you enjoyed Marguerite's journey from heartbreak to true love, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought of her story. Did her transformation inspire you? What would you have done in her place? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts. And if you are not already subscribed, please consider joining our community of love enthusiasts who believe that yearners deserve happy endings and that true love is worth waiting for. We are building something special here, a space where romance and resilience go hand in hand, where we celebrate those who choose their own destinies. Subscribe and become part of our story.